By Guru Besar Lancar Ida Bagus.
Surinamese is not a language. On power, deception, and the romanticization of colonial remnants. In Suriname one often speaks of our language. What is usually meant is Sranan Tongo, casually referred to as Surinamese. It is presented as a symbol of identity, pride, and unity. Yet anyone who refuses self-deception and dares to look history squarely in the eye can arrive at only one conclusion: Surinamese is not a language. It is a historical emergency product, born of oppression rather than cultural autonomy. A language arises from freedom. Surinamese arose from coercion. A true language grows organically out of a people, a territory, a shared history, and a free transmission from generation to generation. Sranan Tongo meets none of these conditions. It is not a mother tongue that evolved over centuries within a single ethnic or cultural community. It is a contact and survival idiom, born on the plantation, not within a culture. During slavery, enslaved Africans from different regions were deliberately mixed together, not by chance, but by strategy. Their languages, rich, complex, philosophically deep, were dangerous to the colonizer. Those who understand one another can organize. And so those languages were forbidden, punished, and systematically destroyed. Language is power. Break the language, and you break the community. What was permitted was emergency communication, a fractured blend of English, Dutch, Portuguese, and residual African sounds. Simplified, hollowed out, stripped of depth, just complex enough to understand commands, just impoverished enough to carry no power. That is how Sranan Tongo came into being, not as an expression of identity, but as an instrument of control. That Surinamese exists is no miracle. That African languages disappeared is no accident. Yet today this construct is sold as cultural heritage, as something to be proud of. And that is the problem. Proud of what, exactly? Of the successful eradication of original languages? Of a linguistic system shaped by violence, dehumanization, and systematic humiliation. Pride without historical consciousness is not emancipation. It is self-deception. Let this be clear, this is not a call for shame about using Sranan Tongo. Its value lies not in its origin, but in what people later made of it despite everything. It became a means of mutual recognition, of humor, of mockery, of silent resistance. That speaks of resilience. But resilience does not turn a colonial residue into an indigenous language. Suriname has no original national language, not because its people are deficient, but because they were linguistically robbed. Indigenous languages were marginalized. African languages were systematically erased. What remains are colonial tools and later learned systems. The danger arises when this reality is romanticized. When a survival form is elevated to the status of cultural foundation, then the past is not processed but rewritten. And whoever rewrites the past remains governed by it, even centuries later. To say today, Surinamese is our language, is not cultural emancipation but historical denial. It is easier to declare a scar an identity than to admit how deep the wound truly runs. Being proud of Surinamese as an own language is like being proud of the chains because one learned to walk while wearing them. This is not an attack on the people. It is an attack on the narrative that keeps the people small. True emancipation does not begin with folklore, slogans, or linguistic romanticism. It begins with the courage to say, "We are not poor in culture. We were stripped of our origins." Surinamese is not a language. It is a memory. A scar. And scars are not to be celebrated. They must be recognized, named, and understood so that healing can finally begin. Concentration, fear, and clarity. What struck me in Suriname when I was younger, and what I long dared not articulate, was this: concentration of thought, discipline, and self-reflection seemed to accumulate within our non-religious fellowship, while fragmentation prevailed outside it. Not stupidity, necessarily, but disarray, much noise, little direction, many opinions, little study, much emotion, little analysis. This is no coincidence, nor a moral judgment of individuals. It is a sociological pattern. The fellowship attracts people willing to submit themselves to rules, to study, to self-restraint, people who understand that freedom does not begin with shouting, but with mastery, that thinking is not an instinct, but a skill that must be trained. Outside such structures, the opposite often flourishes, impulsiveness celebrated as authenticity, ignorance as personal opinion, loudness as strength. Criticism is felt as an attack. Knowledge as elitist. Silence as weakness. In such an environment, thinkers do not thrive, reactions do. This also explains why superficial symbols, linguistic romanticism, identity slogans, folklore without substance, are so eagerly embraced outside the fellowship. They require no study, no discipline, no confrontation with painful truths. They offer the feeling of identity without the burden of self-examination. Within the Vishnu fellowship, by contrast, there is no immediate cheering. Things are weighed, questioned, read, contradicted. That makes the space uncomfortable, but fertile, because thinking is, by definition, uncomfortable. The outside world often interprets this as aloofness or arrogance. In truth, it is something else entirely, a refusal to participate in intellectual licentiousness. The problem arises when these two worlds cease to understand one another, when discipline is dismissed as coldness, and chaos as vitality. Then a society emerges in which those who shout the loudest decide what is ours, including language, history, and identity, while thinkers withdraw or are cast under suspicion. That is dangerous. For civilizations do not die from a lack of emotion, but from a lack of concentration. No, the Vishnu Fellowship is not a collection of better people. But it is a place where thinking is still regarded as a value, not as a threat. And yes, outside it there are no monsters, but there are many who were never taught to order their impulses, to test their convictions, or to face their own history. Naming that difference is not arrogance. It is clarity. A childhood of clarity. I grew up in a world where silence was not emptiness, but clarity. Within the Vishnu Fellowship in Suriname, no one was shouted awake for attention, power, or an imaginary medal. People lived calmly, almost boringly, if one insists on calling it that. There was no panic about devils crawling out from under the bed, no tales of smoldering hellfires, no heaven to be reached for a cosmic reward. Satan existed, at most, in the minds of believers who preferred to be afraid of a figure found nowhere but in their imagination. And frankly, I found it comforting that the greatest threat in my life was merely a thought, not something growling behind the door. What did exist was nature. What also existed was knowledge. What even existed was honesty. And all of this without anyone burdening you with impossible miracle stories, melting seas, or talking sticks. Here I learned that the world is not filled with spirits and hellfires, but with quiet force, logic, and the beauty of what is real. The fellowship was a place where you dared to think, dared to ask, and above all dared to laugh at the frightening fairy tales from outside. That was my universal point of departure. At home there were no taboos. No forbidden thoughts. No spirits hovering above your bed at night because you forgot to pray. No priests deciding what you must think. I grew up with the idea that a human being must think for himself and that nature is the only true teacher. Outside that world, however, another reality awaited, a world not founded on truth, but on fear. The Catholic school I attended appeared, at first glance, to be an ordinary place, a school for children, a place to learn. But once you passed through the gate, it felt as though you entered another dimension, one in which people believed everything that was impossible and doubted everything that truly existed. The children were more afraid than they themselves realized. They believed in spirits rising from the ground at night, in devils stealing souls, in figures invented by parents to enforce obedience. They were more devout than the Pope himself, and that devotion made them blind. Because I thought differently, they tried to control me, to mold my way of thinking, to break my curiosity, to silence me with stories. But they did not understand who I was. You can only control someone who is afraid. And I was not afraid. The more they embellished their fairy tales and Bakra stories, the clearer my insight became. The contrast between the peace of the fellowship and the fear of the school grew sharper by the day. At some point I decided it was enough, not out of anger, not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity. I realized I could not allow my thoughts to be polluted by the nonsense they presented as truth. And so, I withdrew. In the library of the Vishnu Fellowship I found my first real freedom, books on the cosmos, nature, science. No heaven above the clouds, but a universe of infinite scale. No earth with four corners resting on pillars no one had ever seen, but a planet that spins and lives. No waters parting because a prophet lifts his staff, but natural laws that work because they are true. There, among the books, I came to know myself. And there my journey began, not toward belief, but toward truth, not toward obedience, but toward insight, not toward a heaven outside myself, but toward clarity within. For truth is not a promise descending from above, but a light ignited from within. Insight is not a submissive kneel, but the awakening of consciousness. Clarity arises when human beings align their steps with nature, the only guide that never lies and never demands from its children what contradicts life itself. Holy fear. Religion hung over everyone like a heavy curtain. Children whispered about spirits, Bakru, and Yurka that would call their names at night, about devils disguising themselves as dogs, bats, or shadows, about souls being taken. It was as though everyone were acting in a horror film that never ended. The teachers joined in cheerfully. They told stories in which logic collapsed on the spot, that Jesus walked on water as if it were concrete, that Moses split the Red Sea as if it were a door on hinges, that a heaven with golden streets awaited somewhere above the clouds, that the earth was flat, with four corners, resting on pillars no one had ever seen. The miraculous ascent of Moses. And then there was Moses. Because yes, let us be honest, the stories were not merely illogical, they were outright absurd. Moses climbed Mount Sinai as if roadside assistants were already waiting at the summit. No ropes, no hooks, no harness, nothing. He ascended as though the mountain had been neatly paved, complete with curbs and rest benches for aging prophets. No sweat, no panting, no if only I'd worn better sandals. No, Moses walked upward as though on a leisurely Sunday stroll through a biblical recreation park. As if there were signposts reading, Summit, 40 days walk, keep right. And up there, at that impossible height, he was not gasping for air but negotiating over stone tablets. As though it were the most natural thing in the world, pop up the mountain, collect some laws, and stroll back down, no sore muscles, no blisters, no physiotherapist required. And no one ever asked, where is the proof? Except me. Because I asked questions, I became a threat, not physically, not rebelliously, but dangerous to their convictions. They tried to mold me, to instill fear, to cram my thoughts into their narrow frames. But fear does not work on someone who has learned to look at nature. Nature does not lie. Nature does not punish. Nature manipulates no one. And so, their attempts to break me failed every time. I saw children trembling with fear because a priest said the disobedient would be taken by the devil. I saw teachers deriving status from spreading fear. I saw adults behaving like children because they had never learned to question themselves. And I saw the mechanism behind it all. Fear is religion's most powerful weapon. Whoever is afraid no longer thinks. Whoever is afraid obeys. Whoever is afraid dares not seek for himself. But I had grown up in a world where fear was not the foundation. I had learned early on that truth does not depend on who speaks it. Truth stands on its own. Surinamese, I am your friend and a friend tells you the truth.